All right, so last week we left off at the end of Exodus 19. So right up to the point where the Exodus had happened, Israel is out of Egypt. Israel is in the wilderness or on Sinai. And where we're going to pick up here in Exodus 20 is really this initiation of this new covenant or this recapitulation of an old covenant that God is establishing with Israel now that they're a nation and now that they're coming out of Egypt. And so they're in the wilderness of Sinai up against the mountain, and Moses is going up onto the mountain to meet with God. The people are gathered near. They see a cloud descend on the mountain. That's kind of where we left off. And so where we're starting now is Exodus 20, which is, you may recognize that number as where the Ten Commandments are given in Scripture. But that's where Moses goes up onto the mountain to meet with God, and God speaks to him and gives him the law while he's up on the mountain, while the people are down below. And the people are close by. They see the cloud. They see the flashes of lightning. They see what's going on up there. But Moses is up there receiving that. And so really this is a covenant that God is establishing with his people. So he brought them out of Egypt. This is if you remember God's promises to Abraham, that he would establish Abraham as a nation, give him many offspring, put him in a land in which to dwell, and that God would be their God. And so now this people went to Egypt. They're coming out of Egypt. They are a great nation now. They're moving toward this land to which they've been promised. And God is now establishing his covenant with them formally at this point in time. So we have God's people going to God's place, not quite there yet, receiving God's rules. And so that's really where we're picking up. So what is a covenant? Really, it's a bond. It's a fetter is what the Hebrew word kind of means, like a chain, like something that's binding you to something. But it's also a commitment, a friendship, a binding oath. It's really serious. It's more than just like a contract. It's an establishment of a new relationship. So there's two or more parties that enter it, and as a result of the covenant, there is a new relationship established. And that's what's going on here. So God is establishing this covenant with his people. It's initiated by a ceremony, and so we see Moses going up on the mountain. He gets the law written down on stone tablets, which is another piece of showing that this is a covenant. This is something that would have happened in the ancient Near East, where two parties make a covenant. They write the conditions of it on the stone, and this is the evidence of the covenant. If the covenant is broken, the stones are broken, symbolizing that the covenant has been shattered. And we see that happen here in just a little bit. But the promises that then are written out on those tablets, and that includes warnings and curses for breaking the covenant that would be. So if you remember, when the covenant with Abraham was established, there was also a ceremony where God put Abraham in a deep sleep, and God divided these, before Abraham was put into a deep sleep, he prepared the bloody avenue of animal halves to walk through, which was a sign of this is a serious covenant. May this happen to us if we violate the covenant. Then God puts Abraham to sleep, and he walks through. And similarly, it's a different kind of ceremony, but there is a covenant ceremony here that as God gives this law to Moses. So he starts off, there's a bit of a formula here, and if you look at Exodus 20, and he starts off and he says, I am the Lord your God. So there's this preamble to the covenant. This is who he is. He's establishing his covenant with his people. And then there's a historical prologue. So I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. So he's establishing who he is. He's establishing what he has done, and calling Israel back even to the first covenant that he's established with Abraham. This isn't something entirely new. This covenant here that he's establishing is an iteration or an increasing fulfillment of that original promise to Abraham. Then he gives stipulations in that. In this case, it's the Ten Commandments. They're preserved and written down. God writes them on stone and gives them to Moses. on 2 tables to take down, and that's the evidence of the covenant. And it's witnessed by the people that are standing around the mountain, seeing the flashes of lightning and the thunder and everything else. And then they even make signposts of this. So if you remember, they build 12 pillars representing the 12 tribes of Israel at the bottom of the mountain at this event, basically saying, yes, we have received this covenant. This is a sign that the whole nation of Israel, represented by these 12 pillars, representing the 12 tribes, we've received this covenant. And then as we see through the end of Exodus and through Leviticus and on, there are, at various points, blessings for obedience, curses for disobedience in this law. So these 10 commandments really represent God's initiation of this Mosaic covenant with his people Israel, but they also represent, and they are, God's eternal, unchanging moral law for humanity. And they start out pretty basic. So they're divided up into 2 tables. So the first table is our duty to God. The second table is our duty to others. And so in that first table, we have, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. So no other gods besides the covenant God, Yahweh. The second commandment is you shall not make any images to worship. So don't make any representation of what's in heaven, what's on earth, any created thing to worship. And the implication here is this is not saying don't worship false gods this way. That's already covered in the first commandment. This is saying you are not to worship Yahweh this way. He is not to be made into an idol. You cannot own God, as it were. You can't domesticate him and put him in your house and put him in a little shrine in your house or do whatever. You can't do that. He's God. He will not be worshiped that way. The third commandment is you shall not take the name of the Lord in vain. So that includes, utterances, curses, or whatever, but it also includes representing God in a false way, acting, as it were, on his behalf in a way that is dishonoring to God, is violating that law. The fourth commandment is remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. And then he goes into back to creation to ground that commandment. The Lord created on 6 days and rested on the seventh, and so therefore you're going to do the same, and that's going to be a pattern. And throughout the laws for Israel, it's not only these weekly Sabbaths, but there are Sabbath years and even longer term sort of Sabbaths. We have the year of Jubilee, where every 50 years, basically debts are wiped away, everything is reset, and there's this year of celebration and rest. So there's these Sabbath patterns that go throughout, and this is fundamental in God's law here, that rest be regular and be on a pattern, and that we devote that time to God. That's the first table. The second table is duty to others. So honor your father and mother. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. And you shall not covet whatever is your neighbor's. And so these are the 10 commandments that represent, and there's a lot encompassed here. These are representative of many different things. If we really press into them, you can argue, well, there's, breaking one is breaking others. Committing adultery is also stealing. It's also coveting. It's also, and whatever. But they point to Israel and the people of God throughout all generations are to be holy and set apart. And this is God's standard. This is God's law. And this law doesn't change. So following this, so Moses gets the 10 Commandments on 2 tablets, comes down. He also gets other laws. So some of it, you might say it's like case law. If this happens, this is what the punishment ought to be. If this particular commandment is violated, this is what the covenant ought to be. They're about different sorts of things, about different cases, laws about how the altar should be built and constructed, laws regulating and restricting slavery, restitution for loss if I take what is yours or damage what is yours. There's laws about how that's to be handled, and various other social justice type laws about what happens if. And in a lot of these, it's showing that there is a fair punishment or fair compensation that doesn't go too far, but that is appropriate for whatever violation of the law that there is. So it's helping Israel to work out this high law of God on a practical sense. So that's kind of what we see in the following chapters after Exodus 20. And then in 24, Moses comes down, and Israel basically, not that they needed to consent to God's covenant, but they do sort of that. And they say in chapter 24, verse 7, they say, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do, and we will be obedient. And so they declare, we have received these laws, and we agree, like, we're going to do this. And very quickly, they don't do that. But that's, at least they started out with that idea in mind. So the next few chapters in Exodus 25 through 31, we get a description of the tabernacle and the priesthood and how this is all going to work. There's a lot of details there. For the tabernacle, a tabernacle is going to be this place of worship while they're yet to inhabit the land. So eventually they would go into the land, they would build a temple, and there would be a permanent fixture, and they would worship there. They're not there yet. And so this tabernacle is a tent, but this is a tent version of the temple. And so this is where they're going to be conducting their worship, where sacrifices are going to be made while they're still yet to possess the land. So it's interesting that there is a tabernacle. In other words, worship can't wait. We can't wait for us to get to the promised land to worship. Israel needs to worship now. And they can't do this haphazard thing. It needs to be a serious thing with serious rules, following God's laws for how God will be worshiped. As we already saw in the second commandment, God says, I'm not going to be worshiped like that. You can't make me into an idol. This is how I'm going to be worshiped. And so he goes through and makes and gives details about exactly how that ought to be. So the tabernacle itself, it's a building with a courtyard, the holy place, and then in the middle, the Holy of Holies. There's an ark, the Ark of the Covenant, that holds the stone tablets that is to hold the stone tablets that Moses is bringing down. There's a table, a lampstand, a basin, like a big sink basically or bathtub for the priests to be physically clean themselves before they get to work offering sacrifices. And this tabernacle, like I said, prefigures the temple, which ultimately we can trace that all the way through to the very end of the Bible, where the entire new creation is like that Holy of Holies place where God is, where the glory of God dwells. And so this is like a glimpse now, and there's even some really neat stuff in there, just in the tapestries that are hanging in the tabernacle. There's images and imagery of like the Garden of Eden or the Tree of Life that we see kind of refigured at the end of Revelation. And so all along there's these little clues and pointers to this is the way it is supposed to be. This is where God's glory is going to dwell now. But this is going to point forward to a better future reality of that. So anyway, we get the tabernacle. We also get the priesthood explained. And so Aaron and his tribe, the Levites, are going to be priests, and they're going to be set aside as priests for the people. And so what is a priest? A priest is someone who intercedes, who helps the people actually offer their sacrifices. They slaughter the animals. They do all the work in upkeeping the temple and the tabernacle. And the rules for the priesthood and exactly how that's going to play out, we're going to see more and more details on that, especially as we get into Leviticus. But the point here is that there is a special group of people that their whole job is to make sure that sacrifices are being offered regularly, that this whole sacrificial system is taking place rightly, and they're helping the people and interceding for the people before God, offering these sacrifices. So that's kind of what we see right after the Ten Commandments and some of those various laws, right up till the point where Moses comes down from the mountain, and what does he find? So he's been receiving all of this law. First thing, actually before he comes down, God tells him, you better go down and see what's going on. And what is going on, right? The golden calf. So the people are starting to grumble. And they say, he's been up there a while. Maybe he's dead. Is he going to come back down? Did God bring us out here just to kill us? What's going on? And so they said to Aaron, who before Moses has gone up onto the mountain, he says, Aaron is going to be over you while I'm up there, and he's going to be, the head of the priest here. You listen to him. So they go to Aaron and say, make us gods that go before us. And so he says, okay, and makes them takes all their gold that they plundered from the Egyptians, makes a golden calf. They worship it in the style of pagan worship. Aaron even makes like a feast, as it were, to Yahweh out of all this. So supposing that they're worshiping the true God also among all these other gods, and it is a mess. There's this drinking, carousing kind of wildness going on when Moses comes down. And so when he comes down and sees it, he throws the commandments down, shatters them. The covenant has already been broken. These laws have already been broken. So what now? People have been brought out of Egypt. Before the law is even finished being given, it has already been broken. And so we see Moses. This is really, really cool part. Moses actually intercedes for the people there. And he says God's anger is kindled. His righteous wrath is ready to be poured out. And Moses says, kill me, let them live. Don't wipe them out. Kill me instead. Let them go and take the land. Kill me in their place. And right there, in doing that, Moses is acting as a priest, but he's also acting as this substitute, as kind of a prefiguring of Christ there. And the Lord looks at that, and he stays his hand. But he orders Israel away from the mountain, from this holy place where the law is coming. Go away. You're gonna go in, and I'm not gonna go with you. And you're gonna go this and that, and I'm not gonna go with you. And again, Moses intercedes, and he says, if you leave us, we're gonna die. There's no way we can do this. We must have God go with us, go before us, fight for us. We can't take the land of Canaan by ourselves. This is only something that God can do. And so, again, this covenant is renewed and reestablished. And as a sign of that, Moses carves these new tablets that have the law on them again. And these tablets go in the ark. And there's a restoration of this covenant that had been broken. And the Exodus ends with the actual construction of the tabernacle. And there are two guys in particular that God specially blesses with this ability to make all of the stuff, all of the implements of worship, and it's very complex. All the various tents and tapestries and metalworks and the woodworking of the altar and everything, all of that. This Bezalel and Aholiab, he gives this divine ability to make all this stuff and to oversee it. So they are like the general contractors that make sure that the tabernacle gets built. And Bezalel and Aholiab. Exodus, they're mentioned like in the, I think Exodus 30-ish, yeah, 36. Thank you. I think they're set apart earlier, and then the construction of the tabernacle happens towards the end there. And that's kind of where we leave off in Exodus, but we really roll right into Leviticus. And Leviticus as a book is specifically in detail about what is the priesthood like, what are the roles and responsibilities of the priest. There's a lot of details about the sacrificial system and how this is supposed to play out. So up to this point, Israel has a tabernacle, they have an altar, they know that they're supposed to be sacrificing on that altar, but how exactly is that supposed to take place and when, and what are the specific rules for it, and what are the specific conditions, and what about certain yearly events and certain other regular events that come about, how and when, and all the details of that is really what's covered here in this book. So Leviticus starts out, and there's details of this sacrificial system. So right off in the first 7 chapters, we see descriptions of 5 types of sacrifices that people might make. So we have burnt offerings, sin offerings, guilt offerings, grain offerings, and peace offerings. And so there's rules governing each of these, but a burnt offering is basically for general sin, and that's where these are just because we're sinful, we offer a burnt offering. It's kind of like in the Lord's Prayer, we say, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. It's like that. We know we have various sins that we aren't even aware of the particulars of, and we confess that to God. This burnt offering is just covering our general sinfulness. And so for that, it's supposed to be a male sheep or a goat, or if you couldn't afford a male sheep or a goat, you could bring 2 birds. And those would be burned and completely consumed by the fire as part of the offering, the whole animal. Then you had sin offerings, and this is, I have committed a particular sin, violated God's law, and I'm offering this sacrifice to cover that sin. And so this is like a accidental but specific violation of God's law. And for that, it's basically the same as a burnt offering, except the meat part of the animal is not burned, and instead that's for the priests, for them to eat, for their livelihood, and the fat and the offal and everything else is burned of the animal there. And then you have guilt offerings, and it's basically a sin offering, except where if I'm offering a guilt offering, it is because I've committed some sin that particularly harms somebody else, and I have guilt in causing material or bodily harm to someone else. And then you have the grain and peace offerings, and a grain offering is partially burned. Part of it is given to the priest for food. A peace offering is like a sin offering, except that it's just a free will, just offered to God in hopes and in confidence of God's continued blessing. So not for any particular sin, just a because kind of a thing. So there are several things that we see sorry, Life, yeah. Well, the law is whenever you sin, you offer a sin offering. Yeah, and these burnt offerings were more general, not necessarily every day kind of a thing, but regularly. And then in a minute, there's the Day of Atonement, which I'll cover a little bit, but it's sort of the nationwide, this is the day where the high priest gets together, we offer sacrifices for the priests, we offer sacrifices for the country, we cleanse the temple, the tabernacle, and we just, basically, the blood is flowing, and sacrifices are being poured out for all of these things. So that's kind of the one day, but this is happening regularly throughout the year. Yeah. So there's a couple things we can observe about that, just about God in the sacrificial system, and one is that even now, even in this old covenant that we know from the new covenant, that this is the new covenant is better. It can actually take away sins. Jesus can actually pay for our sins. But we know even here that we see that God is a forgiving God. God offers a way. God offers this sacrificial system, even though it was not perfect and couldn't ultimately do it. Ultimately, it pointed to the need for Christ. But even in that, we see God's mercy and God's heart to forgive sin. We also see that this act of worship in offering sacrifices and repenting of sin is part of the people fulfilling their responsibility to the covenant. This pattern of repentance and atonement is part of that covenant and part of keeping that covenant. We also see that these offerings are, even though we have the general offerings like the burnt offering, these sin offerings are specific and personal. And so it's not just I'm a sinner, so I need to offer sacrifices. It's I have done this and I have done that, and that sin requires that animal to die, and this sin requires that animal to die, and my sin collectively requires blood and blood and blood again and again and again, and it's a regular reminder of the guilt of sin. And so when as Christians, when we read through this and we know that Jesus is our once-for-all sacrifice, and praise God, we should remember just the gore and blood of all this, that this is really the guilt of our sin. This is what Jesus died for. This is what he is better than. And our sin costs that. And so the nastiness of this system really isn't an accident. It's to show us how bad our sin really is and how badly we need a Savior. So we can see that in there as well. We also can see that our worship to God is prescribed and specific. God has rules for how he will be worshiped. And we need to be very careful to worship God as he has revealed that he should be worshiped. We also see, that God is merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. So in the next few chapters in Leviticus, we see priests and the role that priests are going to play expounded a little bit. So the priests are consecrated. Moses offers a sacrifice. When he's initiating this priesthood, he offers a sacrifice to cover the sins of the priests, and their garments are consecrated. And they have special garments that are these white robes, these ephods that represent this purity, this cleanliness of sin. And even on the ephods, they have 12 gems that represent the 12 tribes of Israel. And the symbolism in the garment is that they're representing the people before God. And that's their role, is they're an intercessor. They're representing the people before God. And so their job then is to take the animal sacrifice that you're offering as a faithful Israelite. They offer that sacrifice and go before God to offer that sacrifice for you. And so the garments are consecrated. There's that ephod that points to that cleanliness, and that's something that we also see. Just kind of an interesting note. We see the idea of the ephod and just Christ as a high priest. Specifically in the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, where we're told, Christ is the great high priest. He's the final one. There is no other need for any other intercessor. We have Jesus. Jesus is our priest. Jesus intercedes for us, but he's also the sacrifice itself, right? He's the priest that offers the sacrifice for us. He's the Passover lamb and the one offering it. And he's clothed in that white linen ephod like a priest, as we see him in Revelation. We also see in that text the sad story of Nadab and Abihu. So here we have these very specific rules for how worship is to be taken place, how worship is to be carried out. And we have Nadab and Abihu who basically decide, we're going to do it how we want to do it, not how God has revealed to us to do it. We're going to do it in a way that seems right to us. And so they offer, the Bible calls it strange fire to God. They do this religious ceremony that God has not prescribed. They burn something in some way that God has not prescribed. And as a result, they're killed in pretty ugly fashion. So God harshly judges that and says, that is not how I have revealed to you to worship me. You cannot do that. So it's very clear that God requires this particular worship in a particular way. The next section in Leviticus deals with cleanness and uncleanness, and this is a big theme that we see throughout Scripture. And so it's, in general, this idea of cleanness or uncleanness, it's a picture of sin. Okay, it doesn't mean that someone being unclean is necessarily particularly sinful in that moment. There's various conditions of cleanness and uncleanness for all sorts of different things, but the idea is that to be clean means to be ready to worship God, to be ready to go in and worship God. And it's kind of a carryover, it's a consequence of God's holiness. God is holy, so some of these rules seem really strict and particular, and why would this be unclean? Why would it be unclean if I have a rash on my arm? Why would I be unclean if I touched a dead body? Why would I be unclean if I ate certain things or if I had something growing in my house or whatever? There's lots and lots of different things, and none of those are particularly sin. That's not exactly the idea, but the idea of cleanness and uncleanness points to it's a picture of sin. It's a picture of what sin is like. And God requires cleanness and holiness. And so at this point in redemptive history, to approach God meant you had to be clean. You had to be physically clean, but also ceremonially clean. And like I said, there were various things that could make you unclean. It is a visual reminder of that and how we're to approach God. So worship must be very specific and pure. And it's interesting to know too that uncleanness spreads. So if I'm unclean and you come into contact with me, you're now unclean, and you have to go, depending on the type of uncleanness, you may have to go wash in the river until evening. It may be 7 days before you can go do anything. It may be longer than that before you can go do anything, but you're unclean. You're outside the camp. You're away from the presence of God. And so it's a reminder that, this problem that we have is serious, and to be away and outside the camp is tragic, really. It's not a place that we would want to be, but it's a place that we would all find ourselves regularly. Everybody's going to be unclean at one point or another, just because of life. And so it's just this regular reminder that God requires absolute perfection and holiness. And we see that starkly imaged here at these rules, these laws. And it also reminds us that as we are on the other side of the cross, as we have Christ, and we see that what he has done for us is he's the perfect, clean sacrifice. We don't have to worry about this kind of thing anymore because Jesus has paid it all. Jesus has done all of this for us, and he has washed us and made us clean in his blood. And we sing that and we praise that in our prayers. But it's interesting to note that uncleanness spread. And one thing I think that's just amazing is when we see in Jesus in the New Testament. So let's say if I had leprosy and you touched me, you would be unclean because I'm unclean. Jesus goes to the leper, touches him, and Jesus should have become unclean ceremonially, right? The leper becomes clean instead, which is kind of a reversal of all this. And then Jesus raises the child that has died, this young girl who's died. Touching a dead body makes you unclean, but instead of Jesus becoming unclean, the child comes alive and is clean. And so Jesus reverses this and reverses this whole, instead of uncleanness spreading, cleanness spreads through Christ. And it's just an amazing thing to kind of ponder and think about. But any questions, I guess, about the concept of cleanness and uncleanness and what that means? None?
I just thought it was strange in the reading, like how each person's home could be unclean.
Yeah. Like everything.
Go away eventually, like
Burn the house down. Yeah.
I was thinking too, like the idea of uncleanness, it's like separating you from God. Like you have to go out of the camp. Like,
Yeah.
separate us.
Yeah, exactly. That it's a picture of how sin separates us from God. Yeah. In Leviticus 16, we have the Day of Atonement. And so this is this once a year festival that is just even though we're offering burnt offerings, we're offering sin offerings, we're offering guilt offerings, we're doing these things on the regular, still once a year, the priests themselves need sacrifice. The tabernacle itself needs cleansing. The instruments of offering sacrifices for you and me need sacrifices offered for them. And it's just this compounding. Everything needs to be washed and made clean and made pure. And the sin needs to be atoned for again and again and again and again. And so what the Day of Atonement does is, what if I didn't offer this sacrifice right? What if I missed one? What if I've committed some sin this deliberate sin that is not atoned for by this sin offering? What if? Well, the Day of Atonement is this comprehensive sacrifice that is supposed to cleanse Israel, cleanse everything. So once a year, Aaron would offer a sacrifice for the priest, or the high priest would offer a sacrifice for the other priests, for the tabernacle, and for the people. He would cleanse the priests. He would place his hand on the head of a goat. So this is transferring the sin of the people onto the goat. Then he would kill the goat, and he would sprinkle the blood on the worship area and thereby cleanse the altar, cleanse the basins, the sinks, all the worship implements. He would place his hand on the goat and confess the people's sins and say, basically, all the sins of the people of Israel now are on this goat. And then they would take the goat way off into the wilderness, outside of the camp, way away. And so that symbolized the sin of the people basically being taken away. As far as the east is from the west, God removes sin from us. And so this goat is a picture of that they would do every year. The sins of the people would go onto this goat, and the goat would carry the sins of the people outside of the camp. And this is one of the festivals that they were commanded to do again and again and again. So at the end of Leviticus, we have various other laws, laws concerning lots of different things, concerning purity, concerning ethics, especially concerning sexual purity and ethics. And really all of these laws, ultimately, if we step back, all of these laws are really meant to help Israel love their neighbor as themselves. These are just basic equity and justice type laws of what is basically good and right type laws. And Leviticus wraps up with this devotion to the Lord. So we have the system now. We have the covenant that we had at the end of Exodus. We have a system of priests and sacrifices that we can use to keep the covenant. So if we think about it in terms of the promise to Abraham, Abraham now has these heirs. Now there's a nation of heirs of Abraham, and they're going toward the land, and now they have this covenant established, and they have the means of living this covenant. And so it's a somewhat of a positive note. They have what they need, what they should need, in order to keep that covenant. So that moves us into Numbers. And Numbers is really cool. It has some interesting, really odd, interesting narratives in there. But basically, this is a struggle for the land. Yeah, Life?
Yeah, but Leviticus, I was thinking like, it wasn't like the laws that they gave were given, also a way of them separating them, like
Yes.
setting them apart from other nations around.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. So this whole covenant that is established in the second half of Exodus through Leviticus is separating them, and they're to be holy. Separate, holy meaning separated. They're to be holy like God is holy, because God has separated them. They're unlike the rest of the world. They're unlike the other nations. Their worship is different. All the other nations worship little deities and these little regional gods and things like that. And God declares, no, I am the one true God, and you will only worship me. And they have these laws that set them apart as well. And and it's interesting too that like a lot of the laws really highlights their need, their dependence, and their need of God, whereas the cultural standard is more, this is this God that I use to have military might. I sort of control this God. He does what I want him to do when I want to have military victory or whatever over whatever the thing that I want. I manipulate my little household pantheon here, and we get what we want. And God is not like that at all. Instead, Israel is made very aware of their weakness before God. They've got to go and sacrifice their food to God as a covering for their sin again and again and again and again, and trust that God will provide for them. And so they do. And I think it's a really great point. They are set apart, and they're very different in that way. So part of the promise to Abraham is the land. It's a huge promise. And so Numbers is really a question of that. And so here they are still at the base of Mount Sinai, and they're about to go in. And it starts off kind of upbeat, like, hey, we're going to go in. We got this covenant. We got God. We have everything we need. We're going to go get the land. We're going to go take it. And so pretty much immediately, They do a few things. They take a census. They get their priests organized. They purify the camp. They start following some of these laws that they just got. They make dedications of people and offerings. They ordain the priests. They celebrate their first Passover. So it's been a year since they left, and they leave Mount Sinai. So the very first thing that they do is they send some spies to go spy out the land that God has promised. And they come back and they say, hey, this land is amazing. It's flowing with milk and honey. It's going to be awesome, except there are some really scary people that live there, and so we are going to tell some lies about what's actually there, and try to persuade the people of Israel not to go in, not to take not to receive what God has promised. And so several of the spies basically do that. They exaggerate the situation in the land. They say they're all giants. The land itself is going to eat you. You don't want to go into this land. This is a crazy land. And there's two guys, Joshua and Caleb, who trust God, and they say, no, God has promised us this land. We have nothing to fear. Let's go in. God will fight for us, and we'll take the land that he's promised to us. It's as simple as that. We just trust God. But the others who are sowing this fear win out, and the people are afraid, and the people basically say, no way, we're not going in. This is crazy. Why would God lead us out here just to kill us and have us be killed at the hands of our enemies? And they're choosing to disbelieve God's good promises, but they're also basically charging God with wrongdoing, right? Why is God going to lead us out here just to kill us? And even before that, they grumbled about not having food. Did God bring us out here just to starve us? And then God sends manna from heaven, and they said, is this it? Can't we have meat? And so God sends quail, and by the way, judges the ones who were grumbling about the meat, and kills those people. But for the whole time that they're wandering in the wilderness, they have bread falling from heaven every day, and they have quail flying over and landing at their feet every day. And so God is taking care of them. And even then, they're still afraid to go into the promised land because they're not trusting that God is actually going to fight for them. And so as a result, God says, okay, everybody 20 years and older who has basically committed this sin, who's disbelieved me, you're not going into the promised land. And we're just going to wander in the wilderness until every one of you dies off, except for Caleb and for Joshua. And so instead of Israel going straight in, like they were supposed to do, like they would have done, they spend a whole generation in the wilderness. And this wilderness generation, as they're known, is going to die off in the wilderness because they're not allowed to go into the land. And so then lots of things happen. We have various rebellions. So the sons of Korah rebel, and they want to be priests instead of Moses. And so they have this, basically, they challenge Moses' authority. And they challenge God saying, we should be priests to God, not you. And as a result, the ground opens up and God swallows them up alive in the ground and judges them in that way. But it's not good. It's not good that there's that kind of discord. Finally, they go back into the wilderness because they've got 40 years to spend out there. And again, they're thirsty. So they go back to the place where to the same rock that Moses struck before when God said, strike this rock and water's going to flow out. Except this time, God says, speak to the rock and water will flow out. And instead, Moses hits the rock like before and water comes out. And Moses basically said, look, I gave you water. So he takes credit for what God has done. And God says, because of this, because you didn't listen to me, because you basically robbed God of glory, you're not going into the promised land either. And so Moses, because he struck the rock, is not going into the promised land because he disobeyed God. And it might seem like a minor thing, but it really isn't. I mean, like I said, he's robbing God of his glory. He's disobeying what God has said. And as we just saw from Leviticus, God is very particular. The details of the law and the details of the nature of our sin and all that is very detailed and particular. And here we have Moses who explicitly disobeyed God. And so God's judgment is, you don't get to go into the promised land. And I'll just add, it's a reminder of, or it's a good argument against pragmatism. If you ever hear anybody say like, well, it works, so we should do it. Well, hitting the rock worked, but it kept Moses out of the promised land. I don't think pragmatism for itself is a good argument. So as we move on in Numbers, lots of things happen. So there's continued reminders. So some interesting stories. So one is Balak and Balaam. So Balak is this priest, a prophet to a pagan prophet who wants to curse Israel, and he hears about their promise and he wants to keep them out, and so he summons Balaam to come and curse Israel, but all Balaam can do is bless Israel. And there's a whole story there that's really fascinating, but the end result is that despite their best efforts, even the people that want to curse them are only able to confirm God's promises to them. And so God's promises are continuing. We also see the people continue to grumble, and at one point, God sends these fiery serpents out to strike the people, and they bite the people, and the people are dying. And they call out to God for mercy, and Moses makes a bronze serpent, puts it on a staff, and holds it up, and says, anyone who looks on this, you're going to live. The snake bites won't hurt you. And if you remember back in Genesis 3:15, God's promise that the offspring of the woman is going to crush the head of the serpent, and that's through that is salvation going to come. And so this is it's a hearkening back to that. It's a reminder that, look, God is going to do what he said he's going to do. Here's this dead serpent on a stick. He's going to do it. These serpents that are attacking you right now, look to God's promise and you will live. They also divide up the land right before they go in after years of wandering. So they divide up the land to the different tribes, and they prepare to go in.